everyone. Okay, this is part 4 of lecture 4. We left off talking about the cytoskeleton. We finished talking about the microtubules, and then we're going to go on to microfilaments. So microfilaments are the tinier ones. So microfilaments are solid rods that are about 7 nanometers in diameter, so the kind of like thinnest of the 3 in the cytoskeleton. And they're built as a twisted double chain of actin subunits. I'll show a picture on the next slide. And so it's a network of microfilaments that help support the cell's shape. They form a cortex just inside the plasma membrane to help support the cell's shape. And there are bundles of microfilaments that make up the core of microvilli of intestinal cells. So again, remember I mentioned that some cells in your body are specialized to do certain things. So they'll have certain extra structures or more of a certain structure. And so in intestinal cells, there will be bundles of microfilaments. So let's look at pictures. So here are some microfilaments, also known as actin filaments because they're made of the actin subunits. And so these are cells of the intestine that bundle up and make a microvilli. So microfilaments that function in cellular motility, so some cells that can move, have the protein myosin in addition to actin. And so cells can crawl along the surface by extending these structures that stick out of cells called pseudopodia and move towards them. So here's a picture of an amoeboid amoeba moving that way. And then in other kinds of cells, there is this thing called cytoplasmic streaming that they can do. So in plant cells, cytoplasmic streaming is a circular flow of cytoplasm inside of the cells. And this is driven by the actin-protein interactions. So this is showing kind of each of those points. So in a muscle cell, these cells are, for motility. And so in muscle cells, there are actin fibers, and then there's also myosin fibers. And so they interact with each other and like crawl along, and that's how muscles contract. And kind of like the second point on that slide, some cells can stick out their pseudopodium, or pseudopodia, plural. And then that's how they kind of can crawl around amoebas. And then lastly, in plant cells, cytoplasmic streaming is this, like circular flow of cytoplasm inside of cells. So if you were to see this like a recording, you would kind of see a little flow of these things. And so lastly, the third kind of fibers that are in the cytoskeleton are intermediate filaments. So remember these, the size is kind of like a medium between all three. So intermediate filaments range in diameter from 8 to 12 nanometers. So they're larger than the microfilaments, but smaller than microtubules. And so intermediate filaments are more permanent cytoskeleton fixtures than the other two classes, and they help support the cell shape and fix organelles in place. So they keep organelles like fixed in place and not like kind of just free floating. So those three were different. Go back. Those three were part of the cytoskeleton, the type of fibers that make them up. So the cytoskeleton is still inside of the cell. And, sorry, all over the place. Okay. So outside of the cell, there are still also some structures. So some parts of the cell kind of like stick out. So these are called extracellular components. Extra kind of means like outside. So these are components that are outside of the cell. So most cells make and secrete materials to the outside of the cell. And they'll do this to kind of like share resources or communicate with each other, especially. And so these extracellular materials and structures are involved in many essential cellular functions. So one kind of extracellular structure are the cell walls of plants. So a cell wall is an extracellular structure that distinguishes plant cells from animal cells. So this is another thing that's separate, that is different, and it's only in plant cells. So the cell wall and chloroplasts. Prokaryotes, fungi, and some protists also have cell walls, but they're made out of different stuff. Yeah, there's different materials that can make the different cell walls. So the cell wall protects the plant cell, maintains its shape, and prevents excessive uptake of water. So if a cell kind of takes up a lot of water, it's not going to burst because it kind of has that wall to like keep it in shape and not burst. So plant cell walls are made of cellulose fibers that are embedded in other polysaccharides and protein. And plant cell walls have multiple layers, actually, even though it looks like one to us. Again, we've seen it under the microscope, and there are three, multiple layers. So the primary cell wall, let me show a picture really quick. The one that's like outermost, shown kind of in like a pink. The primary cell wall is relatively thin and flexible, and that's what's like secreted first to the outside of the cell. And then there's another layer called the middle lamella. And this is a thin layer between primary walls containing polysaccharides called pectins. And then in some cells, there's a secondary cell wall, and this is added between the plasma membrane and the primary cell wall. So here is a picture showing that. So there's the primary cell wall that's like the outermost. There is this middle lamella. That's the thin layer between primary walls. So you could kind of see it a little bit better here in this picture on the bottom. There's the middle lamella between the primary cell walls. And then these types of cells have secondary cell walls. So other cells, like animal cells, don't have a cell wall, but they might have other stuff on the outside of their cell. So animal cells secrete glycoproteins. Again, remember, proteins that have a carbohydrate attached. And proteoglycans that form the extracellular matrix. So there's all this stuff, actually, again, kind of like the cytoplasm on the inside. You don't see the cytoskeleton typically, but there is, all these fibers, or there are all these fibers. And then on the outside, too, there's a lot of stuff that's not typically pictured in a picture of a cell, but here are all these things sticking out. So the extracellular matrix is made up of glycoproteins like collagen, proteoglycans, and fibronectin. And fibronectin and other extracellular matrix proteins bind to receptor proteins in the plasma membrane that are called integrins. So the cytoskeleton kind of binds few proteins in the plasma membrane. And then the extracellular matrix can bind to proteins also in the plasma membrane. So they're kind of stabilized on either side. Fibronectin and other proteins bind to receptor proteins in the plasma membrane. So this is fibronectin, a protein. So it kind of helps anchor these fibers in place. And so the extracellular matrix can regulate a cell's behavior by communicating with a cell nearby through proteins called integrins. I think that was also shown on that slide. And so the extracellular matrix around a cell can influence the activity of genes in the nucleus even. So they are important in communicating and regulating actions in a cell. And so mechanical signaling can occur through cytoskeletal changes that trigger chemical signals in the cell. And okay, so lastly, neighboring cells in tissues, organs, or organ systems have to work together, right? So they often adhere or stick to each other, interact with each other, and communicate with each other through direct physical contact. So that's how one cell can work so well with another cell and make up a tissue is by being kind of like stuck together, and it helps them communicate faster and directly. So there are different kinds of cell junctions. That's what we call, where the cells actually connect. So there are different names for different kinds. In plant cells, they're called plasmodesmata, that are channels that connect plant cells. So here is a picture. There's two cells. Here's on the below, a top, there's one cell. Below, there's another cell. And so there are these connections called plasmodesmata between the two. So through those plasmodesmata, water and small solutes, and sometimes even proteins and RNA, can pass from cell to cell. And that's directly cell to cell. So like this cell doesn't need to make a vesicle that has to spit something out, and then this one has to do endocytosis. Like this is like a direct line, a direct like channel between them. So they'll pass directly through the plasmodesmata. In animals, there are 3 types of cell junctions that are common in epithelial tissues. So there are tight junctions, desmosomes, and gap junctions. So at the tight junctions, membranes of neighboring cells are pressed together, preventing leakage of extracellular fluid. Desmosomes, also called anchoring junctions, help like fasten cells together into strong sheets. And then gap junctions or communicating junctions provide cytoplasmic channels between adjacent cells. And so here's a picture of the different kinds. So tight junctions, the membranes are kind of pressed together. This. Desmosomes or anchoring junctions help fasten the cells together. So here, there are filaments that stick out and they anchor these two cells together so they form like a sheet. If you were to think, of your skin as like a layer, it's like a sheet. There's desmosomes probably holding these cells together. And then lastly are gap junctions, and these are direct connections, kind of like plasmodesmata. So through the gap junctions or communicating junctions, there are cytoplasmic channels that you just channel stuff directly through each other. And so we've covered all these different isolated parts, but they all work together in a real living cell. None of the cell's components work alone. They all work together. Just like all of your organs pretty much work together. The more you learn about all the organ systems, they work together in a lot of different ways. So for example, a specialized cell called a macrophage has the ability to destroy bacteria, but it involves all kinds of things. It's not just one thing. So it involves the whole cell, coordinating components like the cytoskeleton, lysosomes, and the plasma membrane. And so this is a super overview of everything, all the different parts of the cell, and then more detail about what they do. So I would, maybe make flashcards too, so that way you can remember the name of the structure and what it does, the function. What does the plasma membrane do? It encloses the cell. So that's an option. You can make flashcards, again, maybe drawing the cell or coloring it in. I mentioned that, right? That I uploaded some coloring pages to kind of help if that is something that might be interesting to you. So this is a good summary slide. You could use this as like a overview slide of this whole lecture. So the learning objectives and what you can hopefully do for this lecture when it comes to like an exam. So that is lecture 4.